Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Hi There with Rabbi Leah. I'm so happy to be back with all of you talking about one of my favorite parts of the Mishnah, Pirkei Avot. And as I mentioned yesterday in this program, the reading and study of Pirkei Avot is a customary thing to do during the weeks between Passover and Shavuot. So there's 7 weeks. There are 6 chapters. You're supposed to study one chapter every Shabbat. We're not going to be following exactly that particular schedule because we don't have time to do the whole thing. But I'm going to do some of my highlights, some of the things that I think would be of greatest interest to you, and some of the things that I really love. So first, just to review a little bit from yesterday, Pirkei Avot is one of the sections of the Mishnah, and it appears in the order that's known as Nezikin, which talks about damages. But it is a unique section of the Mishnah because there's very little law in it, which is halacha, and mostly agada, which is storytelling, anecdotes, um, uh, parables, and that sort of thing. So it is for those who don't love reading Jewish law, it's a much more palatable part of the Mishnah. And remember, as I mentioned yesterday, the Mishnah came about around the end of the 3rd century of the Common Era, and it was compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, also known as Judah the Prince. And it is the only tractate of the Mishnah that deals solely with ethical and moral principles. So, as I said, there's very little law, it's mostly ethics. That's why it is called Pirkei Avot, the chapters of our fathers, or the ethics of our fathers. And it's filled with these wonderful, pithy little sayings. So, a couple things I wanted to say before we started on chapter 1 and some of my favorite parts of chapter 1. One of the beauties of Pirkei Avot, and one of the things that I enjoy so much, is the fact that it really brings to life the sages. And, we often hear this phrase, the rabbis, the rabbis, the rabbis said, the rabbis explained to us. Well, who are these rabbis that we're talking about? And when we use that terminology, the rabbis, we are talking about the ancient sages who lived from the 1st century of the Common Era, before the destruction of the temple, which was in the year 70, up through about 1000 or 1100 of the Common Era. We're talking about a pretty substantial period of time, over 1,000 years. And you're going to hear names mentioned in some of these things that we're going to be reading that'll sound really familiar to you. And you're going to hear some of the sayings that are really familiar to you. But one of the beauties of this section of the Mishnah is that we get to know the personalities of these rabbis. I mean, these were real flesh and blood human beings. These were not mythical creatures or characters. And so we get to learn about their likes and their dislikes. We get to know who was kind of a curmudgeon and who was really a positive guy. We get to know if they were more concerned about issues of family or issues of business or issues solely surrounding Torah and that sort of thing. All of it was Torah, but study and that sort of thing. So we really get to delve into their psyche and their what they found to be important in life. So, I can give you an example of, that might display the difference in personality. So, King Solomon is believed to have been the author of the book of Ecclesiastes, known in Hebrew as Kohelet. And if you read Kohelet, there are many, many famous passages, including to everything there is a season, a time to live, and a time to die. Well, Kohelet, the book, opens with the following. Vanity, vanity, all life is vanity. And so when, you hear that, you kind of think, this is not a very positive guy. This guy does not have a Pollyanna-ish type outlook. So I'm just using that as an example of how when you hear what some of these sages in Pirkei Avot are going to say, that it's very highly representative of who they were as personalities. Did they say positive things, or were they looking at the world through a glass half empty or a glass half full, or rosy colored glasses or dark tinted glasses? So we're going to get to know their personalities. There are 3 books that I want to recommend to you that if you find this subject interesting, you might want to read. And I have to get the author of one because don't ask me how I forgot it. It's a book that I have read literally at least a dozen times, if not more. But the first book I want to give you is called Pirkei Avot. And if you don't have a piece of paper or a pencil to write this down with now, I will give you all the information again at the end of today's show so that you can write it down. Pirkei Avot, and it is written by Kravitz and Olitsky. Kravitz, Kravitz, and Olitsky, Olitsky. And I believe it was published by, if I'm not mistaken, either the URJ Press or the CCAR Press. And it's just a great little book that's got the entirety of the Pirkei Avot along with commentaries and so on. The second book is a little headier, but nonetheless, I think a fantastic book because it goes through all of rabbinic literature. As I mentioned yesterday, most of us know what the Torah is, and most of us know what the Tanakh is, the Hebrew Bible. But when it comes to things like Mishnah, Talmud, Shulchan Aruch, Tosefta, commentaries, these are all terms you may have heard, but you don't know what they are. And frankly, they're not unimportant. They're very important because the Torah and the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, are just the beginning of Jewish sacred literature. And so in order to understand, it's so fascinating to read some of these other commentaries, and you have questions. So for example, one of the Seacrest Village residents asked me a question during the Seder. And if you're listening to this, Joe Seller, hi, it was a great question. And the question was, what language did Adam and Eve speak in the Garden of Eden? Well, I have no clue. I mean, we know that they spoke because Eve spoke to the serpent, Adam spoke to Eve, they both spoke to God. What language were they speaking? So it doesn't tell us in the Torah, but if you read some of the commentaries and some of the Midrashim, you will find the answer, or at least what the rabbis thought the answer were in terms of what language they were speaking. So the first book I recommend is Pirkei Avot. The second book I recommend that I mentioned is a little bit headier is a book called Back to the Sources. And it was edited by Barry Holtz, Holtz. And, it's not the kind of thing I would suggest you sit down and just read cover to cover. It's the kind of thing that I would read little bits of it at a time and allow yourself to kind of become acclimated. And what Barry Holtz has done is he has edited a book that goes through all the different sources, all the different sources of rabbinic literature, commentaries, and so on, and explains what they are, the history behind them, when they came about, and so on. And I think it's a great book, whether this is something new to you or something that you have been around for a long, long time. And the third book I want to recommend to you is one which is a novel, and it's one which many of you may have read already. It's a book that I can honestly say was one of the motivating factors, one of the reasons why I became a rabbi. Because after my bat mitzvah at age 37, I continued to study with my bat mitzvah teacher along with the other 11 or 12 students, adult students who were in our class. And this was the primary book that we read. And I became so fascinated with the personalities of the rabbis. And I began to think, you know what? Rabbis can actually have a personality. They don't just have to be some droll, dry guy with a beard wearing a tallis and a kippah. And, I hope my rabbinate exemplifies that not every rabbi looks the same, not every rabbi sounds the same, not every rabbi teaches in the same way. We have our own personalities. The book is called As a Driven Leaf. Many of you may have read it by Rabbi Milton Steinberg. And Rabbi Steinberg wrote the book in, I think, around 1954. Unfortunately, it was published posthumously. He died before it was published. But it became a huge, huge, huge bestseller. And in fact, the most recent edition has a beautiful foreword written by his son, and it's quite moving. So, As a Driven Leaf by Rabbi Milton Steinberg, and it's the story of the sages. And he uses a lot of what we learn from Pirkei Avot and other writings about the rabbis to really bring out their personalities and to tell a fascinating story about one of the sages whose name was Elisha ben Abuya, who became an apostate. He turned against Judaism, turned against God. And by the way, true story. And of course, it is immortalized in a way in this book that makes it a little bit like midrash, a little bit like storytelling, but wonderful nonetheless. So those are the three books. And as I mentioned, I'll give you the names of them and the information again at the end of this class today, so that if you didn't have a chance to write them down, you will have a chance to write them down. So now we start with Pirkei Avot. You can't start with anything unless you start at the very beginning, right? And it is important to understand from the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, which has 18 Mishneot, 18 little segments, little statements. You have to understand from the very beginning. So what the writers of the Mishnah, the rabbis, were attempting to do was to keep the mitzvot, the commandments, and the lessons learned from the Torah intact. Because if you remember, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70, and they had a decision to make. We have no more temple. We have no more home for God. We have no more place to bring our sacrifices. And the Romans rule the roost. And so if we are to keep, I think I may still have smoothie on my face from breakfast this morning. If we are to keep the mitzvot intact, we have to somehow write these down. But more importantly, we have to tell people why it's incumbent upon them to do this. So if people don't think the Torah is theirs, why are they going to bother with it? So the very, very, very first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, the very, very first little paragraph says the following. Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. So that's the very, very first Mishnah, the very, very first statement. So let's break that down a little bit, because I think if we do that for the first one, the rest of them are going to become kind of second nature. So we all know that Moses got the Torah at Sinai, right? And then his successor, Moses' successor, was Joshua. At the very end of Moses' life, he lays his hands on Joshua, he ordains him, and Joshua is the one who then takes the mantle and marches the people into the promised land and leads them in the battles against the various enemies there and takes over for Moses. Now, the reason Joshua was given that very esteemed role was because when Moses, years before, had sent him into the promised land along with 11 other scouts to take a look at the land and see what it was like, only Joshua and Caleb came back and gave a positive report and told the people how successful they would be in the land. The other 10 scouts from the other tribes came back and sent everybody into a tizzy because they said that they were going to go into the land and it was going to be horrible and everybody was going to die. Even though it was a land flowing with milk and honey, it was going to be a terrible place, and the enemies there were the size of giants, and that they were going to squash the Israelites like little bugs. So Joshua became Moses' successor. So what we're learning in this very, very first paragraph of Pirkei Avot is, how did the Torah get from Moses to us today? Or at least at that time, how did the Torah get from Moses to the people living in the time of the rabbis, the time that the Mishnah was written? So Moses got the Torah at Mount Sinai. He transmitted it to Joshua, probably orally, verbally. Joshua then to the elders. So who were the elders? The elders were the Zkenim, the older men in the tribes who had some cultural memory and history of what the Israelites had been through. So Joshua gave it to them, and then they gave it to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. The men of the great assembly were the rabbis of the Sanhedrin, the great assembly, which was this body of decision makers, lawmakers, judges, and so on. And so we see this transmission of the Torah from Moses to the men of the great assembly, the men of the Sanhedrin. Now, it's still not down to us, is it? Because that's still many, many, many years ago. We got to get it to us still. We call this Kabbalat HaTorah. Kabbalat meaning the receiving of Torah. What are the steps that it went through to get to us today? Because that's eventually what they want to get to, right? They don't want to stop it at a place that was hundreds of years ago. They want you and me and everybody who comes after us to understand that the Torah was for us as well, not just these ancient rabbis who lived many, many years ago. And they used to say three things. They said three things. Now, we're talking about a group of dozens of men in the Great Assembly. Did the three of them, did they all speak in one voice and say these three things? This is a literary device. And by that, I mean that we will often see here in Pirkei Avot these numbers used. They said three things. He used to say three things. There are 10 things. There are 7 things. And I mentioned this briefly yesterday. And the reason is that when we know there are 3 things that a person said, or that a group of people said, it makes it easier to remember. If you had to remember, if it said, they said 40 things, it's going to be a little harder to remember what they said. But they said 3 things. Number one, be patient in the administration of justice. Number two, raise up many disciples. And number three, make a fence around the Torah. So what do those three things mean? Well, be patient in the administration of justice. So the Sanhedrin was the primary governing body of the rabbis, and they were the ones they were like the Supreme Court. They were the ones who heard all the cases. And so they are taking their lead from the way in which God ruled with justice. And they're supposed to be patient in the way they administer justice. Secondly, raise up many disciples. What does that mean? Teach a lot of people the Torah. Teach a lot of people the Torah. You need to have a lot of disciples because some of them are going to be good at it, and some of them are not going to be good at it, and some of them are going to spread the word, and some of them are not. So you got to raise up a lot of disciples. And finally, make a fence around the Torah. A fence, F-E-N-C-E. So what does that mean? Make a fence around the Torah. That doesn't sound like, what do you do? Actually build a little picket fence or something? No, again, it's metaphorical. Make a fence around the Torah, meaning at all costs, protect the Torah. That's what a fence is. A fence is designed to keep certain people in and secure and other things out so that it doesn't infringe on your space. So if you make a fence around the Torah, you are protecting the Torah. You are keeping it in a way that it will be pristine, it'll be clean, it'll be understandable to people, it won't be edited, it won't be changed, and so on and so forth. Make a fence around the Torah. So the men of the Great Assembly refers to the leaders who arose at the time of the building of the Second Temple. Actually, that was much earlier than the Sanhedrin. I misspoke. It was not the Sanhedrin. We don't know a lot about them because there's very few sayings attributed to them, but we do believe they had judicial and legislative powers. So now we are at a point where the men of the Great Assembly, the prophets have gotten it, the men of the Great Assembly, and they said these three things. And where does it go next? There's still an awful lot of steps between the men of the Great Assembly in the 5th century before the Common Era and us today. How are we going to get there? Well, we're not done yet. So now we're going to read from the second Mishnah. So the second Mishnah of this first chapter of Pirkei Avot goes on to say the following. Shimon the righteous was one of the last men of the Great Assembly. So Shimon the righteous, Shimon HaTzadik, was one of the last members of this Great Assembly, and he said the following. The Mishnah actually says, Hu Haya Omer, which means he used to say. So, you may have had a relative who always used to say some catchphrase that was the phrase that they were known for. Shimon the righteous was one of the last men of the Great Assembly, and he used to say, the world stands on three things: the Torah, the temple service, and practice of acts of piety. Now, again, we have this formula where he used to say three things, because once again, it's easier to remember that he used to say three things, or that the world stands on three things, than it is to try to remember that they said 20 things. So he used to say the world stands upon three things: upon the Torah, upon the temple service, and upon the practice of acts of piety. Now we're going to hear something similar to this later on, because other rabbis said three things also. So this is Al HaTorah, V'al HaAvodah, V'al Gimilut chasadim. Do you remember hearing that anywhere? Al haTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gimilut chasadim. Al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. Al shlosha devarim, upon three things the world stands. Al haTorah, al ha'avodah, al gimilut chasadim. Acts of loving kindness, acts of piety. So if you ever wondered where that came from, it comes directly from Pirkei Avot, Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous, who was, they call, a remnant of the great men of the assembly. He's one of the old timers, and this is what he used to say. So when we sing Al Shlosha Devarim, we are hearkening back directly to the Mishnah, to this guy who said these things, and it's kind of amazing that we keep it within our modern sphere, even though it was said so many hundreds of years ago. So we're going to do one more Mishnah, one more little segment, and then I'm going to give you the names of the books again. This is an interesting one. Are you ready? Antigonus, a man of Soho, not Soho, Soho, received the oral tradition from Shimon the Righteous. He used to say, "Do not be like the servants who serve the master in the expectation of receiving a reward, but be like the servants who serve the master without the expectation of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you." First of all, the name. The guy's name was Antigonus, a man of Socho. That does not sound like a Jewish name to me. I don't know about you, but it does not sound Jewish. It sounds Greek, right? Antigonus. So understand that the Jews were now living amongst the Greeks and the Romans, and they were acculturating. They were assimilating. They were beginning to take on names, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, whoever heard of a Jewish girl being named Brittany or Tyler or Morgan, or whoever heard of a Jewish boy being named, oh, I can't even think of anything, Matthew. But kids used to be named David, Molly, Esther, Ruth, Michael, those kinds of names. So Antigonus of Socho has a Greek name because he was assimilated into Greek society. He received the oral tradition from the guy before him, who was Simon the Righteous, and he used to say, "Don't be like servants who serve a master expecting that you're going to get a reward. Be like the servants who serve a master without any expectation of receiving a reward." And so we're being told here that we are supposed to be good Jews, follow the Torah, not because we're going to get brownie points and some kind of a reward at some point in time, but because it's the thing to do. We're supposed to do it. And because it's an expectation of us, not because God is going to reward us. And at the end of this, he says, "Let the fear of heaven be upon you." And the word for fear and the word for awe in Hebrew is the same word, yireh. And so when we say fear, we also mean awe. So Antigonus of Socho is saying to us, let the awe of God be upon you. Don't do things because you think you're going to get in trouble if you don't do them. Do them because it's the right thing to do. Or don't do them because you think you're going to be rewarded. All right, real quickly, the three books. Pirkei Avot by Kravitz and Olitsky. As a Driven Leaf by Rabbi Milton Steinberg. And Back to the Sources by Barry Holtz, Holtz. Again, Pirkei Avot by Kravitz and Olitsky, As a Driven Leaf by Rabbi Milton Steinberg, and Back to the Sources by Barry Holtz, edited by Barry Holtz. And if you need these again, I'll give them to you the next time we have Chai There with Rabbi Leah, which will be on Friday. Don't forget tomorrow morning we have a last day of Pesach festival service. And lehitraot, everybody have a wonderful day. I will see you tomorrow for services at 10 a.m. Bye-bye.